Welcome to the Devy Digest powered by League Winners. Today we are talking about C2Cs and how we do our roster construction. I do have a guest today. I am joined by none other than Noah Green. How's it going, Noah?
Andy, I'm doing great, man. How are you?
Good. Not too bad. So before we get into the topic today and everything, what what got you into creating content? Tell the people about yourself and all of that.
Yeah, for sure. And first of all, just I'm excited and fired up to be here. We talk all the time on Twitter, and just really love your work, and I just love talking ball with you. So very excited to do it in person. I'm very new to the Devy and C2C space, and kind of went from zero to content creation in literally one off season. Like I did my first C2C startups, my first Devy startups even, and then began hosting a weekly podcast called Devy Digest, all in the same off season. So it was a crazy track up for me. I learned about the format, and I've always loved college football. And I think for me, it was in some ways an excuse to just get back into college football and have a way to talk about it, and a community to talk about it, and a format to play with it that allowed me to use some of that knowledge, that allowed me to think differently about those players. I have played Dynasty really I started playing Dynasty during COVID, and maybe it was, I think the first year I did one was literally, I want to say it was 2019 or 2020 when we started. But the first league I started was literally during COVID with some friends. So I'm actually like very new to the whole format, having played fantasy for a while. But I very quickly loved the Devy and C2C space. I think that it is new, it is refreshing. There are a lot of people that were really instrumental to me getting into this community that I'm real thankful for. Kevin Coleman over at Devy Royale, Felix Sharp, Colin Decker, Austin Nace, a bunch of the guys over at C2C that I could thank. And then met y'all over at Dynasty Pros, you, Tom, Justin, SC, all those guys as well. And it was just a very welcoming community. Like, people were just very excited to bring folks in. And I dove in literally head first. I mean, what I actually did first was I did a bunch of C2C mocks, and then leapt into a startup. I did two different formatted startups this past off season. One was like a full college, more traditional full college, full NFL side. The other was hosted by Chris, who doing some work with over at Fantasy and Frames now. He created this format where you would draft a 70-team college roster, and then the NFL side would build over years. So you would only get your players that you graduated from college, which was a really interesting, different format. I think I like dove into that one. And then a lot of my thinking about strategy, honestly, which is why I'm so excited to talk about it today, is it's a lot of lessons learned from the first year that are going to change and inform the way that I actually am going to approach startups moving forward. But there was an approach I took even to startups right from the beginning that I'm excited to talk about. So I just think the space is so much fun. I think college football is underrated. I love it. It is so different than the NFL. And that's really how I got into it, was just like finding that space. And my first Devy draft was with Mike Lamoureux, Nerd Boy, who I'm working with over at Dynasty Digest now. And even from that first draft, it was just invigorating and exciting to learn and think about college players in different ways. I encourage people to just give it a shot and not be afraid by the format. I didn't do Devy for like 2 years wanting to, because I thought it'd be too much. You can do it. You can get in there. You can definitely at least do a Devy draft where you draft 4 or 5 college players and just give it a shot and see how it goes. It's just fun. It's a fun format, and it stretches your knowledge, and it stretches your understanding of the game. And I've just had a blast with it.
Now, I get this question a lot when when someone's trying to do or think about doing a C2C for the first time, they're like, it's a 45-man roster or a 50-man roster. I don't even know 40 players that are in
Right.
college right now. So uh, a lot of people have that mindset that's very daunting. What is your approach when you tell people to jump on in?
Yeah, so I think a couple things helped me, right? One thing was immediately identifying, like I quickly, when I first was joining, I quickly identified that there were two places in the space for me. One was the Devy Royale, and the other was the Campus to Canton team, and that they had resources that I could use to get a sense to learn more about players. They had articles, they have YouTube videos, and they've got people who I trust and know to be talking and tell. Look, the thing with one of the things that makes the college side so daunting, in addition to just the breadth of players, is that there isn't a set. You can't, if you were just trying to start Dynasty for the first time, you could go. There are some centralized places where you could go, and people have different rankings, people have different valuations, but there's enough, it's close enough. Like if you're looking at rankings on just keep trade cut, dynasty trade calculator, player profiler, they're different, but the variance isn't anywhere close to how different it is on the college side. So that's what's also crazy is like if I don't know players and I want to learn about a player, I could go and have people value that player in vastly different places. You look at rankings, Devy rankings, C2C rankings by position, and there are so many different factors to take into play. How do I account for CFF product? Like, so it is complicated. I say find a couple of places that you trust. And I think, Andy, the work you're doing, you are a person to trust. Like you, and honestly, some articles that I read about players coming in were your articles that I just found online and used it to learn about players. And then I just started to kind of look at I looked at numbers too. Like you know, trust yourself that you know football. And the thing that can get intimidating with this space that I'm now noticing is see a lot of people sort of putting out, I have a model. Like I have a model for producing. I have you don't need first of all, there are too many models. And B, you don't need a model. Like you don't need a perfect model. You don't have to have a perfect spreadsheet. You can look and say, I'm looking at numbers. This is kind of what I know about college football. I can take an approach to it where I start by looking at, like, I started really thinking about Power 5 stuff. Like, I did not start by extending myself out into the broader conferences all that much. I made myself aware of things. The other thing I would suggest to people getting into the space is try some mock drafts and some very low stakes. So the way that I kind of started to accumulate knowledge was the Campus Can guys were putting out a bunch of mock drafts and I just joined them. And then the Devy Royale guys were putting out a bunch of mock drafts and I joined them. And when I joined them, I started to get a sense of who's drafting who, what's the chat, what are people saying in the chat about these players. As I'm doing that, I'm accumulating knowledge by having to do that. And by having to look in and force myself to make a decision in a mock where it's low stakes, trying that out. Then I tried a few, Jared, who hosts Chasing the Natty, put out a bunch of these like $5 CFF best ball drafts. I joined those because I had never done CFF before, but I wanted to get in. And I'm like, this is $5. It's like super low stakes. I just want to get in there and practice taking players, see what the reactions are like in the chat. Also getting to know all these people. Like part of the thing is I built these relationships. So then I would ask them questions and I would say, oh, I'm learning about a player. How do I value this player? And ask questions and look at it as a process of accumulating knowledge. And when you start to feel comfortable enough, then you can kind of jump in and join a draft. But I think trying a couple of mocks first is a really good way to get yourself used to the format before you're doing it for stakes. if you want to try that. And I think I definitely, one of the things that we'll do in the off season is host some C2C mocks for literal first timers. And in that case, it's like you get in, and I want it to be a learning experience for folks, because that's what other people in the space did for me. Like Dynasty PJ hosted one, and he was so helpful with, like, he would literally answer questions mid mock. I would be like, what do you think about this guy versus this guy? And you just start to accumulate knowledge, and you start to get a sense of what you're thinking. So getting in there and trying it for me was, because it's so big and daunting, the only way to do it is, for me, was to get in and learn by doing, like learn by mocking, learn by drafting, get a sense of where these go. And then I would reach out to people and say, can I see other mocks? Can you just share the results of them with me? And I would look at them and start to then look at players. And then the last thing I did was, especially on the Devy side, I started asking for historic Devy drafts from previous years, because then what I want to do is I wanted to see, like, oh, what did this look like last year, so that I can have a sense because I know that's how I look with Dynasty. That's how I learn in Dynasty over time. So my biggest suggestion to people who are new to that space is, don't be afraid to get in at a low stakes cost and just try it. Get in and start drafting and utilize some of those resources. And I've helped countless people with C2C drafts in my DMs, and people can just, I'm happy to help people. My Twitter handle's here, but like, meet the people in the space. They're such helpful, like giving people, like all the people I've named so far, that I'm sure I'm missing many more that might just come up, because experiences might just come up. I learned a lot just by deciding I wanted to learn about it and then trying it.
Yeah, and I know for me, how I got into it was, like you were saying with PJ, I got in on a couple of mocks. I kind of figured out exactly what was going on. I think one of them he did, I think it went 30 rounds. So like it really forced me to look at these players. And what was nice is, he had a spreadsheet with, player names and, all these quarterbacks, all these running backs, all these receivers. And personally, what I did was I will look at these players. I'm like, I don't know this player. I'm going to Google him. I don't know this player. I'm going to Google him. And then eventually over time, you kind of figure out what schools do really well on the, producing offensive weapons and their systems. And you can kind of tailor it for like a real basic understanding. Okay, this offense historically does well, so I can kind of lean into this team and maybe see if I can get a quarterback or a receiver. And then, after a while you go, okay, the MAC conference, they're pretty high scoring. Maybe I can get a couple players from
CFF.
here. Yeah.
Yep. I couldn't agree more. Like, that's like, it's huge. And it's just like the way, and like the Googling thing, that's why I say it's just like, like I'd have my ESPN app open and just be putting in, and then I'd look at schools and I'd start to, like you're saying, look at their stats, like just organize wide receiver production and which schools tend to be there year over year. Like I would just doing little like basic, oh, I have a thought, let me just like look this up. It was not I'm going to decide to spend 2 months accumulating a canon of knowledge. And then like the way I learned was doing it like that and improving knowledge as it goes along, and like not being afraid to make a mistake when you're like, this is a new format. Like, it's okay to make a mistake, right? You learn from it. So.
And I do think that's also a really good thing with these C2Cs, because now you have the portal and you can treat the college side as more of a redraft, where if you do make a mistake and you don't draft that well, you can churn your roster, because every year there's a 15-round sub draft that you can churn that roster and make some trades. And if you make a mistake the first year, there's always next year. And it's not like a regular dynasty where if you're rebuilding, it might take 2 or 3 years.
Right.
In a C2C, you can go from last to first on the college side the very next year.
Instantly. And you can overcome, like, I mean, look, so like talking about like diving in a little bit to this like roster construction thing. I mean, so the first C2C draft I ever did, Matt Tincher, who I've shouted out before, hosted that. And he's awesome. Also, I met Chris in there. I met a bunch of people that I chat with. And I actually met Tom in that draft too. And then we just started chatting and it turned into a content opportunity. So again, like the theme of this for me was just getting in there, meeting people, having chats with them. Like I met Tom in a league, we started chatting, and the next thing I knew, I was jumping on to Devy Pro shows with a bunch of guys and chopping it up, having a blast. And it was fun. But like, so the first draft I did, I was 108. I drafted Raheem Sanders. Like my first ever C2C pick, high stakes pick, first round pick was Raheem Sanders. I say that because I ended up as the runner up in that league on the college side. I ended up third place on the NFL side, and I have Bo Nix, Malik Nabers, Jacob Cowling, and I've made trades. I have a bunch of dudes coming up from the college, like and then Tet McMillan, Rasheen. Like I've got players for. So the reason I say that is that's the first big high stakes pick, and I made a huge mistake right away, right? And it's like you learn. And what is the lesson I learned from that is, frankly, I hate to say it pretty simply, I'm not going to take a running back in the first round of C2C league again, ever. Number two, just be really like the high production repeating year over year. Similarly to the NFL, high running back production doesn't always repeat year over year in college. This year, we saw a bunch of running backs who we were not expecting to produce. And a bunch of the ones we did expect to produce huge did not produce huge. And so just expecting that production, that doesn't always maintain either. But yeah, you can make mistakes. Like it's really like, it's okay. I looked at, like, I see you've got Dorian Singer on coming up on a slide. Like I took Dorian Singer in like the 8th or 9th round. I have a lesson learned from that one too. Like I have lessons learned from some of these picks where it's like, where they might've just been, a mistake. I thought I might have made a mistake drafting Malik Nabers in the 3rd round when I did it at the time. I wasn't totally I was like, oh man, did I, like, is this guy's Devy ceiling not high enough? Like, I don't know if it's as high as some of the other guys I could have taken from younger class. Turns out that ended up being awesome. So, you just kind of got to get in there, and then you learn about these players over time and figure it out. But, it's an interesting, it's just a really fun format. Cause like you said, the way that leagues can change kind of on both sides is significant all the time.
Yeah. So before we get too deep in the weeds, let's go with some quick hitters here. Now, with these, we're going to talk about, with news that just happened in the past couple of days or so. We have wide receiver Isaiah Bond. He goes from Alabama to Texas. Texas also gets Silas Bolden. You have tight end Amari Nyblack entering the portal from Alabama. So Alabama is losing a bunch of guys. Jed Fish is named Washington head coach. Jeremy Bernard, the Washington wide receiver, has entered the portal. Arizona ends up naming Brent Brennan as head coach, formerly of San Jose State. Supposedly, Noah Fafita and Tet McMillan are going to stay at Arizona, but Jonah Coleman has entered the portal. It's likely he ends up at Washington. JJ McCarthy has declared for the NFL draft. Dorian Singer goes from USC to Utah. And then Tulane picks up a couple wide receivers, Shaz Preston, Mario Williams. And then we have Ryan Williams. He decommitted from Alabama. He's visited Texas A&M. He had an unofficial visit with Alabama, I believe 2 days ago. He is scheduled to meet with LSU, followed by Alabama, Texas, and Auburn. I don't know about you, Noah, but I really want him to go to LSU or Alabama.
Oh yeah. So the Texas wide receiver room has very quickly become a really messy situation in terms of who's getting the ball. Because in addition to Bond and Bolden, they obviously already added Matthew Golden. They have Jonte Cook there. I just think there's some there are still some. I think him going to Texas at this point makes his early production a real question. And Auburn, I still just don't have. I still don't have faith in Auburn to produce a passing attack that I'm excited about, and frankly to develop, like you were talking about at the beginning, about which schools tend to develop wide receivers and put them into the, like, Auburn has not historically been a place that does that. So I would love to see him at LSU or Alabama, where they do produce that. At Texas Tech, if Texas Tech gets him and Micah Hudson, my goodness, that's going to be an interesting thing to see how Texas Tech handles that much wide receiver talent, honestly. But yeah, Alabama or LSU for me would be beautiful. What do you think about this Texas room with Bond, Bolden, and Golden now?
I think it's stacked. I mean, you have all these receivers, but then you have Quinn Ewers still there who can't throw
Yeah, you are still
the
there.
deep ball.
This is the
So
problem. All these deep
yeah.
receivers, and he's not, and he can't throw the deep ball. Like, Worthy became a short receiver this year because he couldn't go deep. I don't get it. Other fun thing about those transfers is I was talking to Todd Vincent about this, another one of the best guys in this space,
Yes.
my former co-host. Todd knows high school players and just player eval in general, as well as basically anyone I know. And
Yes.
we were just talking about the Tulane. And Tulane, all of a sudden, with Ty Thompson, Mario Williams, Shaz Preston, like, that becomes, they've got Mekhi Hughes at running back. Like, they are an interesting non-P5 school that I will be investing in that offense.
They also got a 4-star cornerback that they were able to land on the recruiting trail. So Tulane, it looked like they might struggle after Fritz left, but once they got that Troy head coach, he's done wonders.
Yeah, he's done great, and that program's been really good. And look, they compete with P5 schools. They won a major bowl they beat Caleb Williams and my Trojans a couple years ago. They're a strong team, so I think they will continue to be so.
Now, you're a USC fan. How do you feel about Miller Moss and then bring in Jaden Maeva?
So Miller Moss, I'm interested in Miller Moss. He played great in the bowl game, and the fact is, so the reality is Malachi Nelson couldn't pass Miller Moss on the depth chart. Now, was that talent? Was that coaching? We don't know the full situation of what happened there, but the reason Malachi Nelson left is that he couldn't pass Miller Moss on the depth chart. And USC has, look, the fact that Lincoln Riley is confident enough in Miller Moss going into next year that he hasn't yet grabbed any. I know we were in the talks for Will Howard, but when that went away, I frankly would rather roll with a Miller Moss than a Will Howard, because I'd actually like to see what he has. And he fits the mold. Some of the breakout quarterbacks that we have seen in previous years, like let's look at this past year: Jalen Milroe, Carson Beck, Jaden Daniels, frankly. I know I'll throw a guy that I think might be next year into these, one of your favorite guys, Garrett Nussmeier.
Yeah.
They're guys who have been in programs with consistent head coaches who have maybe sat for 1 or 2 years behind a much bigger name, and who have learned a system and then come in and they outperform our expectations and they raise in value. And they're guys who have stayed a couple of years in those programs, who were big time recruit. Like Miller Moss was a big time recruit. He's got dual threat ability. He lit the field up in the bowl game. He can definitely throw it all over. I like the arm strength. Like, I'm very interested to see him. I think he'll be more interesting than people think. I don't think USC is coming into the Big Ten and going to win it this year necessarily with Miller Moss. But I don't know if he'll be the problem. The issue this past year, Caleb Williams was not the problem at USC this past year. The problem was an abysmal offensive line. Really, actually not they thought it was going to be a stacked wide receiver situation. It was a little less stacked than I think it was hyped to be. It wasn't a bad wide receiver situation, but I think Caleb elevated it more than it was. It's not this Texas wide receiver room. Let's put it that way, right? That wasn't the way it was. And I think Miller Moss is going to be an interesting candidate. He'll be someone I would love to grab because I don't think his value is going to be as high as his potential gain and rise could be. But he fits that profile of a guy that I want to see how he does. And I think Link knows that he has to do some more winning. This past year was not good. So if he's confident rolling with Miller Moss, and who else do you want developing your quarterback in college football? Like, it goes to the history point of maybe Sark, maybe Kiffin, who's put more NFL QBs, who's had more Heisman trophy winning QBs than Lincoln Riley. So I like the idea of grabbing his QB who's been in his system for the last couple of years now and who won that job outright based on talent. Like, they let Malachi Nelson, 5-star #1 recruit in the class, go in order to roll with Miller Moss because Nelson wanted to start. That's the way I look at it. And that's not saying Nelson can't still. There's not a criticism of Nelson. I don't know anything about what happened behind the scenes, but what I know is if that's the talent investment, that's a big deal. Like, these college coaches want to win. Like, they don't want to just start your Devy darling. They don't want to just start your C2C darling. Like, Oregon then roll with Austin Novosad. They went out and got Dylan Gabriel, right? Like, these schools are not going to, like, Ohio State didn't roll with Devin Brown. They went out and got Will Howard. So for Lincoln Riley to, right now at least, be comfortable, and maybe they get into somebody else in the portal, but if he's rolling out as a starter, I'm optimistic at least that he can do something.
Yeah, so that's kind of a headway into our topic today with our C2C approach. You mentioned Austin Novosad getting recruited over, Devin Brown getting, the broad transfer in, all these guys that at one point we had, Devy hopes, and they were probably taken round 8 to round 20 of a startup. Let's talk about a C2C approach from as a startup. How do you approach it? Now, I know the traditional pathway for a C2C for drafts is the first 10 rounds you go Devy, and then you start to taper off and then go into C2C. Are you more of a heavy Devy player where you go into like round 20 and still getting those freshmen, or do you kind of pivot away sooner to go to CFF assets?
Yeah. So I am a heavy Devy drafter. And I'll extend my heavy Devy drafting a little bit farther than some probably might. I will draft Devy into the 20th round, into the 25th round. But it's also about how you look at Devy. And you have to kind of like, so for me, my focus absolutely is Devy. I think that C2C and CFF production is hard to predict, although there are some guys that do a really good job of predicting. Jared's one of those. Justin Volume Pigs is fantastic for, like, if you are looking for hidden gem CFF production. There are people who put that out, but I just find I can get that later. And what I'm really looking for, it sounds oversimplified. I want to draft really good players. Ideally, I'm drafting players that can contribute on both sides of that coin, right? So, my favorite draft picks of this past year, like a guy like Malik Nabers, Tep McMillan. Those are guys. Tep McMillan to me was going far too low in drafts, for example, right? Because he had both Devy and CFF upside in a huge way. So actually what I'm trying to do as much as I can is, if I can get guys that are going to produce both on the Devy and the C2 and the CFF side, I'm going to push and try to get those guys early. But I'm not going to sacrifice Devy upside for CFF production, because I think the thing about playing this game is we've got to take some risks. Like the fact is the hit rates are low. It's very hard to predict years out. But what I will do is I will just invest in young talent early and often and hope that it's going to develop and hope that it's going to pan out. I think that, when I look at it from a positional perspective, I focus wide receiver very early. One of the biggest mistakes that I made this past year, a couple of drafts, was taking quarterbacks early and taking young quarterbacks early. I think that's a really tough game. I think we've seen it with Malachi Nelson went anywhere as high as 10th, 9th in drafts. Dante Moore was going incredibly high in these drafts. Now, Nico might actually hit big this year and is going to be really high up on those draft boards. It's just QB is so hard to predict who's going to win these jobs, who's going to actually be good. And sometimes they have to sit for a few years. And I'm not going to spend a high asset on a young, you won't see DJ Lagway on any of my rosters. You won't see Julian Sayin on my rosters this year. Like, I will not be investing in that kind of talent. And I didn't actually last year. Something just told me I don't want to do this. I want to invest in wide receivers that are heavy producers and have a chance to be in the top 3 to 5 of their wide receiver class. Like, that is the number one thing I'm going to try to look and stack for early as much as possible. Is the guys that have that high-end talent, those high-end tools that I think can pay off with being a 3 to 5, because when you get one of those, it becomes an anchor to your team and it becomes an asset you can use kind of on both sides as it goes along. And I'm going to hammer that pretty early. I'm not afraid to go. I don't think the running back position, I don't think considering the running back position dead is a good way to go about drafting. And I'm willing to draft young running back talent that goes to big name programs and willing to do a little bit of waiting. So I do have exposure to guys like Justice Haynes, that kind of thing. Like, I'll invest in those guys in the mid rounds, and I'll invest in some freshman running backs this year. I'm going to be more cautious about taking running backs actually that are closer to the NFL, because I think they're going to go in faster unless it's a Bijan, Jahmyr Gibbs, TreVeyon Henderson, obviously this year, for example. Like, I think TreVeyon Henderson is in that class of prospects, so I will take him there. But I'm looking for those blue chip assets early. I'm looking for guys that can become blue chip assets. I'd rather end up with 2 out of my first 8 picks hitting and having 2 elite assets coming in than I would having a bunch of kind of watered down guys without the same ceiling, if that makes sense. Like, I'm playing ceiling early.
Yeah, so going back to the quarterback position, even if we take a look at, say, Arch Manning, last year people were saying he
Yep.
has a clear pathway. Quinn Ewers is going to be here for 1 year, and he's going to go to the NFL, and then it'll be Arch's team. Well, that didn't happen that way.
Didn't happen.
Yeah, Quinn Ewers is coming back, and so I think for this year's crop, you can say the same thing with Julian Sayin. I think a lot of people care. I think a lot of people project him to take over next year, if not earlier, because they're saying, Jalen Milroe, he's got 1 more year left, and he's going to go to the NFL, and then Julian Sayin will just be the next guy up. But now with the board being there, who knows what's going to happen? So I do think taking a quarterback early is a risky proposition. I did take Malachi Nelson in one of my C2C startups, and luckily, being a C2C, I can kind of get that CFF production at Boise. But
Now you
as
can,
far as his Devy asset, he's dead on the Devy side right now, unless he balls and go to a Power 4. But other than that, it's not looking good.
He's dead. And it's like, yeah, I remember being on the clock in like the 7th round or something like that, 7th or 8th round. And I remember actually like jumping in, and this goes to also when you're doing this, it's okay. Like ask resources for help. Like I remember, I think I jumped into a Discord and said, who should I take here? Ty Simpson or Devontae Walker? And I was leaning, I was thinking Devontae was kind of my thinking. And then, but the advice that I got was to take Ty Simpson. I understand why that advice was there, and I'm not saying it was bad advice, but it's another. If I'm doing it again today, I'm going to take Devontae Walker in that situation, and that was the at the time dilemma. I'm sure actually, if I look back at it, there were other people on the board that I actually might have. I actually probably would have prioritized somebody with an even potentially higher Devy ceiling than Devontae Walker. And I should clarify, I like Devontae Walker a lot. He is a top 10 wide receiver in this class for me right now. And I say that when I say upside, I mean there were guys on the board at that point who have an upside to reach the top 3 to 5 in their wide receiver draft class. And I want to take a chance on that upside. That would be where I'd go at now. But I took Ty Simpson, and Ty Simpson is a completely dead asset now. Former 5-star recruit. What was the narrative? He's going to take over at Alabama. He might take over this year. Jalen Milroe obviously won the job, obviously won the hearts and minds of everybody on this crazy run. And now I've got an asset, and Simpson hasn't transferred yet. So far, I'm not even getting any CFF production out of him.
Yeah, I know for me last year in the startups that I did, I kind of pivoted away to CFF early just because there was Rasheen Ali and Malachi Corley,
Sure.
and I wanted that production. I'm looking at it this year, and I don't see any CFF guys that are going to be valued that high for me. So for me this year, this upcoming season, when I'm doing startups, I'm going to be going Devy heavy because I just don't see anyone out there that can produce like a Rasheen Ali did or like a Malachi Corley or something like that. So I do think you have guys every year that take CFF early. There,
Yes.
if you're doing a 12 team roster or a 12 team league, there's always at least one or two that just hammer the CFF
Hammer
side.
CFF.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And
That with
that
this
doesn't
year, I've gone
always
like,
hit
yeah.
either.
No, that's the thing. Like if you took Austin Reed early in a draft this year because of CFF production, that might not have hit, and they're not guaranteed to hit. So that my thing is, if I'm going to invest early, the CFF is not a guarantee to hit their production again. Like you said, following the coaches, right? Coaches change, systems change, players transfer, their rooms change. All these kinds of like all these factors play in. If the only I took one guy in the top 10 rounds of my 2 Devy drafts this year. I took one player that fit the CFF producer kind of mold early, actually 2. But I picked them because to me, they also it was in a later draft. I had done more research and they had also Devy possibility for me. One was Michael Pratt, quarterback at Tulane, because I did more research. And I was like, I actually really like this guy's game translating potentially to the NFL. I'm not sure he's going to be a top QB, but he's now going to the Senior Bowl, has entered the draft, is getting day 2 potentially draft buzz. So he may, in addition to producing CFF, he's got some Devy. And the other one was Torrey Horton, who I just researching all of these sort of CFF lock produced receivers, Torrey Horton being 6'1", 6'2", returning punts really fast, broke into his route tree, really great route tree breakdown, working with Jay Norvell, who's produced NFL receivers before, most recently Romeo Dobbs, coached Marvin Harrison, Reggie Wayne back at Indianapolis, like that. So I invested in him. He ended up being a great CFF producer, and now turns out he's going to be. But this is the thing, even if you're taking a guy you think is going to go over. So that's another point of this is thinking when you're building a C2C roster construction, there's also the thought of, I'm more interested in these college players that are going to go earlier into the pros, like that are going to come onto my NFL side a little faster. That is an equally dangerous idea because as we're seeing right now, you don't know when those guys, like if you were counting on Travion Henderson on your timeline to come on to your NFL roster and take you over the top as to give you that other top end RB, you don't have that now. He's back in school. You'll get and his CFF production is probably going to be cut a little bit because of Judkins. Now, I have no Travion to me is the same in Devy as he was 2 days ago. I think the idea that he's hurting his draft stock by going back is nonsense. I don't think he's hurting his draft stock. Say, oh, he would have been RB1 in this class. He wouldn't have been. He'll be like RB6. He won't be RB6 in this class. He's actually still my RB1 in the 25 running back class right now. I think he's that good. But either way, if the NFL has a second round grade on a guy, they're going to draft a second round. They're going to draft him in the second round. The NFL some years drafts 6 running backs in the second round and some years drafts 2. So if he didn't have a first round grade, he wasn't going to get one this year just because there aren't enough running backs. Like if a team has that grade on you, they're going to draft you in that place no matter what year it is. I don't think he hurt his Devy outset, but that was long just to say those ideas, those like, I'm going to draft this and I'm going to kind of plan for this guy to be the next guy to take over, or this guy is going to graduate this year. You don't know.
Yeah, as far as the running backs go, going back to Travion, I think with this year, I I think with the NFL draft, what you have is last year it was a pretty deep group and a deep crop, and a lot of teams took running backs. This year, to me, because last year there were so many running backs taken and so many teams, took a running back, that this year teams don't need a running back. So I think it actually helps Travion because I I personally view this year as the buffer year for the NFL, that they're not going to want to take a running back because they already have running backs that they took last year and the year before. So by him waiting another year, you're going to see 5 or 6 running backs go in round 2, maybe even late round 1. So I do think it is a smart move that he went back to school.
Yeah.
And he's not going to hurt himself. And as
No.
far as with the C2C, to me, the worst way to approach a C2C is treating it as a pipeline to your NFL roster.
Yes.
That is the worst way to do, because
Yes.
if you're doing a startup and you're doing it on the NFL side first, and you're gonna be like, okay, I'm going to take 3 quarterbacks. I'm not going to take any running backs because I'm gonna load up the running backs on the college side because they're so
Right.
easy to predict, and then I'm just going to hammer quarterback, wide receivers, and tight end on the NFL side. Your roster is going to be really incomplete, because if you're
Yes.
going to treat it that way, you're going to realize fast that these quote unquote Devy assets, they miss like 80% of the time.
They do. They miss a lot, and you just don't. And I couldn't agree more. You have to take your college side. If it is, we call it like supplemental drafting. It is a supplement. It is a tool to supplement, but it's not a guaranteed tool to supplement. And honestly, look, I have changed the way that I play Dynasty Fantasy Football also, and it mirrors how I've changed the way I play C2C, where when I went through a stretch in Dynasty, and I still have a couple of these teams where I was like, I'm going to get as many first round picks as possible. I'm just going to load up on these first round picks. If you did that, and I'm going to I'm going to approach every startup I do, I'm going to trade back, acquire firsts, do all of this. Listen, I think the whole concept of this, like, oh, I need a tanking rebuilder. I'm never tanking. I'm not tanking on either. So when I approach a C2C draft, I am approaching my NFL side to win now and sustained as much as possible. I want to win now and I want to sustain the winning. On the C2C side, I want to win now and I want to sustain the winning. Like, that is the way I approach it, and I want to have as much high-end talent in my combined roster as possible. And I also will play the value game where I am willing to, like, I think when we think about the C2C side, it's interesting to see how people value sort of draft picks versus like a player on your C2C roster. I think we get really attached to these prospects that we have on our C2C side because they might hit. And I am not afraid to move them for proven NFL talent, especially in the middle of if I'm competing unexpectedly but I'm also always trying to win. So if I can trade someone who is maybe not producing as consistently on my C2C side, as long as I feel that's a movable piece, I'm willing to move it to get production on the NFL side all the time. But yeah, I don't recommend approach. I think you're exactly right. It's not a pipeline. It's supplementary. You have two different rosters. You're trying to win on both sides. And then anything that comes over from the C2C to the NFL side that adds value is a boon. Like that is awesome. And that is great. And that's what you're actually looking for. But you can't look at it as a supplement. Like you got to treat your NFL roster like an NFL roster, and you got to build it like an NFL roster and not go, I'm going to go light on the RB on the NFL side. And then I'm going to go heavy on this. No, you're not going to predict you're not going to predict that. Like, that's what I thought. That's what I thought with the Raheem Sanders thing this year. And it's burned and I'll never do it again. It's not the game to play.
Yeah, because these actual NFL scouts who do this for a living, they miss a lot.
All the
So
time.
yeah, so how are we going to hit it when these NFL scouts miss all the time,
I mean, we just saw we've just seen if I have a bunch of Jackson Smith and Jigba. And I also have a bunch of Puka Nacua, thankfully, because I got in enough on him. But see, that's luck. So the thing is, to your point, looking back at it again, nobody's drafting Puka Nacua over Jackson Smith and Jigba. And it remains to be seen who will be the better receiver over their career, although it isn't actually gonna. I would be very shocked if it changed. I think JSN's ceiling remains very high. Puka is not going anywhere. The fact is, when these guys hit who are outliers, they stick. They tend to stick. The pattern is they tend to stick. But yeah, you're right. We don't know better. We aren't going to just get these things right. Projecting, if you're drafting for value and you're drafting for skill and talent and you're drafting to see those players develop and you're hoping that they have a chance to get into the NFL and then that they have a chance to hit. And the fun of it is to draft guys you think are really talented and figuring out a way to get for yourself to know who are the players you really like. Like I know for you, it's just like the joy of like Kevin Concepcion being such a joy to have that hit this year. Like that's so fun to have that. That's the fun of the game. But the thinking that he's like, we don't, and from a Devy perspective though, could Kevin Concepcion go all the way through and become, a day 2 NFL draft pick? Maybe. It's not impossible. Let's see how he produces the rest of and let's see his tools let's say his tools continue to develop. Let's see how he does now that he's got a bunch of former 5 stars in his wide receiver room. It's a little bit of a different ball game. I think he's still the number 1 there, and I think they'll continue to feed him. But let's see how that goes. My guy this year was Mikey Matthews, who I loved his talent. Went to Utah, produced actually pretty well for a freshman at Utah. And now he's transferred to Cal. Is he going to be the next sort of Cal volume pig guy? I don't know. It's hard to predict these things, and you can't approach your roster that way. You have to approach it with drafting as much talent as much talent with upside as you can, getting as much production as you can, while ideally taking guys that have both. Again, I'm always trying to look for both. Like you mentioned Rasheen Ali. Like I have some Rasheen Ali. I thought he was a guy who might be able to sneak into the draft board, right? Somewhere, get on an NFL roster. With a running back, if you get on an NFL roster and it's the right opportunity, you got a shot. So that's what you're kind of looking for. But I'm going to still draft talent. I'm going to draft talent and tools first on the running back position, because with running back is unpredictable. There are random pieces to it. But the guys who remain RB1s and stay RB1s over multiple years are guys that have elite tools. They are, like, you look at the list, it's, who is it? I mean, there's a couple of exceptions, like Eckler is an exception, but by and large, you look at that top: Brees Hall, Jahmyr Gibbs, Christian McCaffrey, Travis Etienne, Jonathan Taylor. These guys that have staying power are guys that have those elite tools. That's why you invest in, like, I'm okay investing in Justice Haynes, because the likelihood, if he hits and stays, he might be that real number one. Like Travion has that ability to do that, right? So with that position, you go with that, and then you throw darts at production and hope that production can carry over. And with wide receiver, you're looking for, again, you're still looking for upside. You're still looking for upside talent. You're looking for recruiting pedigree. You're looking for tools. You're looking for program fit. And transfers are fun to, the transfers is going to be fun to see. So,
Yeah, I think with going back to Rasheen Ali, I think it's very important for going forward for a lot of the C2C players not to bank in multiple years of production, because when I took Rasheen Ali, I took him, I want to say, like in the 7th round of the startup. And I'm thinking he has 3 years of eligibility left. I can get a CFF stud
yeah.
for 3 more years. I only got him for 1 year, and now he's going to go
Yeah.
to the NFL, and he's probably going to be a day 3 pick, and we'll
Yep.
have to see what happens. So, yeah, I do think that's very important. As far as quarterbacks go, what is your theory on that for roster construction? Are you someone that goes quarterback heavy, like 15 quarterbacks in a standard 2 QB league, or do you go light with like maybe 5 or 6 quarterbacks?
So it depends. It depends on the format, and the waivers a lot. So like the first C2C I did, I went with the latter. I went 5-6 quarterbacks. And I'll just, so in my reflection and adjustment into going forward, I'll share who those quarterbacks were, because it's kind of it's actually a fun little retrospective. So those quarterbacks were, I got, and I'll go in order of where I drafted them. So I drafted Connor Wegman in the 3rd. I drafted Ty Simpson in the 7th. Then I hit Riley Leonard I drafted Bo Nix in the 11th, Riley Leonard in the 13th. And then I went with Jalen Daniels from Kansas in the 19th. That was a steal at the time, I thought. Taylon Green from Boise State, now at Arkansas. And then it looks like I grabbed Cal Swanson really late in that draft. And then Malik Murphy I picked up off waivers. So that team was competing the whole year. But by the end of the year, I went into it and I shared it with a couple, and they were like, oh my God, you have like 5 surefire starters. Like, you're set. It's going to be fine. Anyone who followed college football this year knows when you listen to those names, it wasn't fine. It didn't end up being fine. Like, Riley Leonard got injured. Connor Wegman got injured for the whole season. Jalen Daniels was out basically the whole season. I got lucky with a couple of Malik Murphy spot starts, and then Taylon Green sort of lost his job a little bit and then got it back a bit in the end. So I was able to at least start a second quarterback. But and that's a league where there were only 4 waivers. So it was limited waivers. So it's also paying attention to the league you're in, because if you're in a league without limited waivers, I'd be more like, if I can do waivers all year at QB, I will go lighter at QB in the draft, because the thing, as we've seen this year, is you can pick up really elite college QB, like CFF QB production from waivers all the time. Guys that are not getting drafted in 45, in standard 45 drafts. And even in bigger leagues, you could get, like Jaden Mayava, you mentioned, who's now transferred back up at USC. But if you picked him up in the middle of the season, he gave you great production at UNLV. He gave you great points every week. There's a guy I always forget, the San Diego State freshman that everybody that produced a bunch this year.
Name
You know who
escapes me.
yeah, you know who I'm talking about though.
Yeah.
Like you can grab guys like Sorsby at Indiana. There were a bunch of guys that put up really good sort of college production. Noah Fafita, Arizona, jumped into that job. Kyron Drones, Virginia Tech. Like you could get those guys. And so I'm going to invest light in the draft if I can keep picking guys up off waivers because I can get production there. And I'm going to be cautious about drafting even what seems like slam dunk high end talent, unless it's drafting this past year Caleb Williams. I'm going to be very cautious about drafting those high. We have seen guys who are QB1 projected 101 in the pre-drafts before the season end up becoming day 3 picks at quarterback. I'm just very cautious there. So I'm going to go light there. But if your team, if it's limited waivers and you're locked, I probably will go a little deeper just because of from this past experience this year of getting kind of stuck with, I can't grab anyone off waivers. I need a QB. And now I'm trying to talk with league mates and they're trying to way overcharge me for their QBs because they know I'm screwed if they don't do that. So that's how I would kind of approach it. I would go less if I can, more if I have to, but I'll go more on the back end and I'll just try to get guys that I think are in starting roles that have a shot to produce, but it's so unpredictable.
I know for me, if I'm doing a startup and I'm doing the NFL side first, if I'm picking within the first 5 or 6 spots on the NFL side, I can get a young QB like Hurts or a Mahomes or Burrow or one of those elites. I'll do that, and then I'll come back with maybe an older quarterback that still has a few years left, and then probably try to pick up a third. And if I'm able to do that, where I'm not picking out 112 or 111 on the college side, I always advocate to go to at least 10 quarterback deep, just because you have bye weeks, injuries, and stuff. And as you pulled up one of your rosters, I pulled up mine just for fun, and this was one league that I have. For quarterbacks, I have Byron Brown, Caden Salter, Daquan Finn, Frank Harris, Seth Hennigan, Avery Johnson, Malachi Nelson, Garrett Nussmeyer, Jaden Rashada, and Jalen Raynor, and then Braden Shager. So for this league, I maybe have 1 or 2 Devy quarterbacks, maybe, and the rest are just CFF assets because for this one, I'm trying to hammer the CFF side, and I was able to win this league on the CFF side, but I think predicting who's going to do well, who's going to be an actual Devy guy, trying to predict who's the next Caleb, who's the next Drake May. No, you're going to be set for failure. So I always try to advocate on the NFL side. Always start on the NFL side first
when you're on the NFL startup.
And then try to get that young stud. And if you're drafting at 112 or 111, try to see if you can trade up. If not, go for one of those wide receivers like a Jamar Chase or something like that. That's there, or whoever. Sure. And then on the CFF side, you're going to have to hopefully hit and get a Devy quarterback and not a CFF quarterback.
Yeah, and you're gonna have to get lucky. Like it's the first draft I did, I got Hurts in the first, and then I got Dak in the third. And having Hurts and Dak on your NFL side for the next 3 to 5 years, you're kind of everything else is plug and play. Like I have Bo Nix, so Bo Nix is gonna come over and he might be a QB3 for me. But like if you can get 2 guys to anchor your NFL roster, that really helps a lot. And then I agree. I am hitting all CFF on the QB side moving forward. That will be my approach, is to go heavy CFF production deep. And again, the waivers is the only thing that might change how deep I go. But I agree with you, going deeper is better, because I got burned this year and it was just injuries. Otherwise, it would have been a very different story. So,
and then for me, I always try to overflow a bucket of just so much talent, whether that be a quarterback, wide receiver, running back, and then trade from where I'm strong to where I'm weak. I think
Yes.
not enough managers do that. They try to quote unquote get a complete roster. It's like, oh, I already have 9 receivers. I need running backs. No, just keep plugging
Draft
away.
value.
Yeah, just take
Draft
value.
value.
Yeah,
Good players.
just overflow that bucket with talent where you can trade and
Yes.
get better players overall.
Yes. And you do not need, like, you can go in, you can be weak at 1 to 2 positions. What you are trying to do is accumulate talent, like you said, then make trades when you need to and across the spectrum. And you don't have to fill a C2C roster. You don't have to fill an NFL roster. You have to have a lot of talented assets that have high ceilings that can grow.
Now, if we were to switch to these sub drafts that's going to take place in the summer,
Yeah.
we can take a look at you can kind of approach this with the rosters you have, but as far as your approach that way for the 15 round draft, are you going to hammer away all these Devy assets? Like when you get to a tier 3, tier 4, quote unquote Devy asset, are you going to pivot away to get some of the top remaining CFF guys? Or are you going to keep plugging away, knowing that these guys can transfer multiple times, and if they don't do well the first year, you have that in your pocket where they can transfer somewhere else, like a Jalen Brown from LSU to Florida State?
Right. Right. Yeah. I think so. What I'm gonna do is uh for sub drafts, definitely early sub draft rounds 1 to 4, 1 to 5, I'll actually say 1 to 3 to like the midway through the fourth usually is where most of the really high end talent is going to go and where the 5-star talent is going to go. And the thing is, when you talk about hit rates at the running back and the wide receiver position, the hit rates on the hot, like there is, you are at least slightly increasing your odds of hitting when you're taking those high-end prospects. They don't all hit, and it's not an exact science, but it is worth a gamble because when they do hit, the upside is so high, and those guys get locked in and become these really top recruits for a while. So you look at the top of the Devy wide receiver landscape right now: Luther Burden, Evan Stewart, Tet McMillan. All these guys are Zachariah Branch, Carnell Tate, like all these guys were high end, right? So it's worth investing there. I probably this year will switch potentially to CFF a little bit earlier in sub drafts than I would in startups because, and it depends on what the talent pool looks like in each of those drafts. First of all, like depends on how each league is different. So in leagues with limited waivers, the talent pool in your sub draft is going to be incredibly high. And then there actually will be some tougher decisions earlier about whether or not you transition and grab some of these guys that are still in college that are transferring around. There are some sub drafts are really stacked in talent. But what I also found is when I went CFF this past year, and maybe I just went the wrong CFF guys, but even when I transitioned to CFF, I took guys and a lot of them didn't hit and they ended up being wasted picks. Like and even in rounds 10 to 15, I was taking guys like Frank Peasant at Mid Tennessee State, who looked like he was gonna. A lot of people wrote about it. Looked like he was gonna explode. CFF did nothing. ODU
Nothing.
Allaire at Bowling Green was a guy I took in like a 13th round. Did nothing. So I'm gonna be a little more like Braylon Braxton at Tulsa was a quarterback that I took. Doug Brumfield, UNLV. Like I took some of these guys thinking they would be in the sub draft setting, thinking they could be CFF producers. And the fact is they weren't. And so I'm like, unless you're the type of CFF producer where I think there is the possibility of, like, I think Rasheen Ali's value was inflated a little bit, but as an asset archetype, I like the asset archetype of a guy who can give me even one really good season of CFF production. And then if you can be a day 3 pick and get on an NFL roster, you're at least an asset. You've given me a shot, especially if you're a running back. Like, if you're a running back on an NFL roster, you're worth rostering in in fantasy, because we don't know what that position gets injured so frequently. So to me, I look at it that way. So I'm going to go heavy Devy early, pound the freshman. You're probably not going to get a ton of high end freshman talent from previous years, but like, I know in one of my supplemental drafts, though, for example, Kevin Concepcion is not on a roster because that league had a
Doesn't
limit
have
of
me in
4.
it.
It doesn't have you in it, but that league had 4 waiver pickups for each team for the entire season. That was it. A lot of people used them early preseason, sort of myself included. Again, strategy learned. Like, I wasted one on DT Sheffield, like utterly ridiculous. Didn't need to do, right. Like, I learned that lesson, but there was a lot of, that's where I'm learning these lessons. There was a lot of buzz. And then somehow he didn't produce quite enough early on the CFF side when people had their waivers. And I just looked, I'm like, wow, nobody picked him up all year. So him being in the mix, that is it. He's where I would start. Like, an asset like that of that level is somebody who I would start to consider taking early on. Carson Beck was in some of my sub drafts this past offseason. That's where I say, like, if Miller Moss is going to be in some of them. Oh, yeah. Miller Moss will be a guy I will start. If he's going to be the starting QB at USC, I will start to consider him in the 3rd round at least, if not earlier, because that upside has a real shot to hit. And and if I miss on it, like, if you at the end of the day, if I miss, I might miss anyways. But I'm going to go heavy freshman early and then transition over. But I want to take guys that I'm a little more, I'm wary of some of these very lower end, because I just got burned on them. They just, I haven't found their hit rates to be much safer than guys that have much higher ceilings.
I know with KC, if you're in a league with guys that go CFF heavy and they're picking towards the end of the first, that he might go in the end of the first, depending on what manager is.
Oh yeah. He could go early in the first.
What I want your take next is these crowded rooms with these multi-time transfers. So, we take a look at Alabama at the running back position. They have Daniel Hill and Kevin Riley. Last year they have Justice Haynes and they have Richard Young, and then Jam Miller still there.
Yep.
If you take a look at Auburn at the wide receiver position, they have Perry Thompson. They have Cam Coleman. They have who's that slot guy that
they got Robert Lewis in transfer from Georgia State. They got another transfer too, right? I think.
Yeah, they also got Bryce Kane, who's a high 4-star. Yep. And they have Malcolm Simmons, who's a 4-star. So, yeah, you have rooms like that. And then you have Nate Frazier, who's at Georgia, in that running back room. If we're taking a look at those situations, are you going to lean into them and say, hey, if they don't fit at their current school, they can at least transfer out? Or are you going to pivot away? Like, I know for a fact with the Auburn receivers, with Cam Coleman and Perry Thompson, they might go within the first 3 rounds. So are you going to say, you know what, I'm not going to guess on which one? I'll rather get a Jeremiah McClellan from Oregon. I'll get a Bryant Westco at Clemson, Nye Carr at Miami. Or what is your approach on these crowded rooms?
So my approach, especially when I'm going into a supplemental draft, especially with freshmen, is I'm going to take the talent. Like, I'm going to take the players that I think are the most talented with the highest upside. I think projecting the situation is really complicated, especially with these freshmen. And I'm going to invest in the talent. And look, sometimes it's going to miss, and that's going to be a thing that will happen. I know both of us have talked about, with freshman wide receivers, especially what you're looking at is year 1-0. So I'm not expecting a ton of production. I will also be interested to see how year 1-0 evolves in the next, not how it has so far, but how it will evolve in the next few years. Because like you said, like Jaylen Brown's a great example, right? He was a year 1-0 this year, but now he's transferred and was an incredible talent. I love the talent. He might do something. Like Oregon has not played a freshman wide receiver in I don't know how long. So whether Jurian Dickey is a dead asset at this point or not, I'm actually not confident in saying. I'm not going to invest the same capital I invested in him this past year, where he was a second round supplemental pick, even a late first round supplemental pick, sometimes being a 5-star. But he is still I'm not upset with making that pick. So I'm not afraid of the crowded rooms. I'm going to invest in the talent. I'm going to take Justice Haynes and Richard Young and not be afraid. I liked Justice Haynes better than Cedric Baxter this past year. I took Justice Haynes over Cedric Baxter, despite the fact that it looked like Baxter at the time had that path to potentially early CFF production, which inflated his value. What happened? Jonathan Brooks actually ended up winning that job and got most of the CFF production this year. So you actually got about the same CFF production from Haynes and Baxter. And so what you should do is take the player that you actually think is better. So I'm willing to invest, and I'm not afraid of some of those crowded rooms. I think, if the player is really good, they'll emerge in the crowded room anyways, no matter what. B, there's the potential you have some transfers going. And I'm interested to see how these talented guys play out that just couldn't get their ways onto the field this past year. And maybe it does mean that their odds of being really good players has just gone down a lot, and that may continue. But I'm interested to see how that goes. So I'm not afraid of the crowded rooms, and I'm going to take a shot at the ceiling. And it's going to be rare that, like, I especially with college, with the transfer landscape, what I would say is I'm much talent over situation, more so than anything else, because situations change so much. I'm not counting on situations. So if you like Cam Coleman, but you're worried about the crowded room, like, I'd take Cam Coleman. I would be comfortable taking Cam Coleman. When he went to the Under Armour All-America game, he got all the attention with all that stacked talent in there. I'm going to take him. If you like TJ Moore or Bryant Wesco, but you're nervous about Clemson wide receivers, I wouldn't be I would take those talents because they're really good players and they're going to find ways to produce or transfer, and you should invest in your talent. Like, that's my feeling. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I do bet on talent, and I do think the year 1-0 with these freshmen in the portal, I think the next couple of years, I think we're gonna see that evolve where, someone like Jurian Dickey, Brandon Innes, Hakeem Williams, there are a bunch of guys who didn't hit. But these guys that don't hit and then end up transferring, I want to see what happens to them. Like with Jared Brown, I do have shares of Jared Brown because I like Jared Brown. I know Todd Vincent liked Kyle Parker based on value, so he liked him.
Totally.
So I'm interested to see what happens, because before you only had a one-time transfer essentially, but now you can transfer multiple times. So I think it helps these guys, and then if you have them, it helps it props their value up. I mean, Brandon Innes not transferring out, does that hurt? Possibly, but he could also play a little bit of a bigger role next year. We don't know that. I do have one share of him, and I wasn't able to trade him, so I'm stuck with him. So I have to see how that pans out. But I do think this year 1 0 is going to get modified in a couple of years just because of how the landscape is. It's just so different nowadays.
It's so different. And again, it's where these coaches want to win. And now what they can do now, which they couldn't do before, is they can just recruit in more talent to step into those roles, and then the freshmen don't end up getting on the field and playing as much. And so you see like Oregon goes out, lose Troy Franklin, go get Evan Stewart. Tez Johnson comes back, all of a sudden is Jurion Dickey going to have a role this year? I don't know, and I don't know how much it's him versus the room. He was a very raw wide receiver prospect, and it's something where I look back at the year 1 0s who didn't. I went back and did the year 1 0s who hit in the NFL, who were actual year 1 0s over the past like 7 or 8 years, and a couple. There aren't that many, but the examples of them. Terry McLaurin was one of them, but like DK Metcalf was one of them. Nico Collins is now one of them. There's actually a little bit of a pattern where some of these, what do DK and Nico have in common? Big, raw wide receivers who took a little bit longer to develop and then ended up hitting that kind of athletic freak specimen. So I'm interested to see that. But you're right. The transfer portal has changed this so much. And I think at these big time programs, coaches are not always just throwing freshmen onto the field just to get work. We saw Florida State, Hakeem Williams and Vandrevius Jacobs got like a little bit of run here and there, but didn't quite hit the year 1 0 threshold. Are they going to this year? They've got some transfer. Now you add Jaylen Brown in there. You've got 3 top 300 receivers now in that room that all have the ability to do so. It's just going to be interesting to see how that works and whether some of the year 1 0 changes because the landscape is changing, which may make it less likely for as many freshman wide receivers to hit the year 1 0 targets. Like we may actually just see fewer players continuing to hit those. I wonder if that's something we're going to see. I'm not predicting it per se, and then what does that mean for that talent going forward? Could we see some examples of guys transferring and then breaking out in new settings?
I think this past season, I think it was only 12 or 13 receivers that hit the year
Yeah.
1 0. And I'm looking at this crop coming up, and it's very talented, but a lot of them are in situations where they might not get that run the very first year. Like when I'm taking a look at at these wide receivers, Micah Hudson seems like he's gonna hit it. Jeremiah Smith. But then when you go to these guys like a Ryan Wingo at Texas, Cam Williams at Notre Dame, the Auburn guys, Draylon Miller at Colorado, there's talent there, but are they going to meet the threshold? And I do think the year 1 0, while it's been effective, I think with the portal and how recruiting has changed, I think the year 1 0's got to change as well. I think maybe the thresholds that they have, for 10 catches, 100 yards, whatever else they have, they might have to modify it just because of how everything is. Because I'm taking a look at Ryan Wingo. He's someone that's really raw. He has some traits, but he's not going to get any run at Texas. So he might be like that, DK Metcalf, that Nico Collins, where he doesn't hit a year 1 0. Maybe he ends up transferring out of Texas, but he ends up doing something somewhere else and still gets some draft capital. So I think a lot of players, if they do 100% believe in the year 1 0, you can really get Jurion Dickey for the cheap.
Yeah, and you should get those talents for cheap. And it's not to say like I'm not someone who's going to say I'm out on guys who don't hit year 1 0. And I also understand it doesn't mean they cannot hit. It just means their odds are reduced. And so if you want to play, there are people who will just play the odds game and say, I'm out. And if there are people who will do that, and you can get like, would I rather have Jurian Dickey than an 11th to 15th round supplemental pick, yeah, I would, because his upside as a 1-2 first or second round player is still there, and I would rather have the chance that if he hits, the ceiling is that much higher. And I'm willing to take a little bit of a calculated risk there, only if the cost is right. I'm not gonna spend up for him, but Brandon is the same way. I'm willing to spend if the cost is right, because I think those guys are talented. And with those 5 stars, again, it's about evaluating the talent. Like, I'm not a Ryan Wingo fan in general. And not just because of Texas. He just, to
He's
me,
raw.
I'm not sold. He's really raw, and he's never played real competition. And I'm not sold on his ability to translate it yet. And I could be proven dead wrong. He also just doesn't look on tape to me the way that a player of that profile should against the competition. He doesn't look, it should look like a much vaster talent differential than it looks like to me. He should look like he's dominating. He's playing kids that are 220 pounds. Like, he's playing again. Like, he's just, so I don't buy that yet. But still, you're absolutely right. Like, the point being, we don't know what these rooms are going to look like. We don't know if these guys are going to get the run and are going to get the production in the first year. We think Jeremiah Smith is going into OSU because he's that good, but they also, don't forget, he's not their only 5-star. So they've got others. They've got Mylan Graham coming in, who I would bet is less likely to get that run. Might he end up being someone that transfers? He's another, lesser competition talent that is interesting. So I think you're absolutely right. And I think it'll be interesting to see with the year 1-0 if they change it. I actually hope they just kind of keep it the same and continue to track it, because the thing about it is it isn't predictive. It isn't like, oh, guy hits year 1-0, that means he's going to hit and be an awesome asset. Like, you look at the guys who did hit this past year, and there are plenty of them that I have a ton of questions about, even though they did hit, because what it does is historically increases the odds and the likelihood that they will at some point in their career hit a top 24 or a top 12 NFL wide receiver season. And so what I will be interested to see is whether, as we go along, and we won't know this for 4 to 5 years, is if the odds start to change at all. Especially, I think, looking at like really last year and mostly this year, like this transfer portal and this new world is real, and this NIL world is just coming into reality. We are going to need 5 years of data to actually change and know how those rates, because it's about the likelihood that they hit. But, look, Puka is an awesome example of that, because Puka was a top 300 recruit who hit year 1-0 targets at Washington, and is now another data point to say, you look back at that recruiting class and you're like, oh, he was in there. People say small school, never did. No, he actually, and there's another data point that his odds were better because he was that. Michael Wilson with Arizona was a sleeper. His odds were better. So it's just an odds game, but I'll be interested to see how it evolves. And we all want these, like, don't you? I want these wide receivers to do well. Like, I want Jaylen Brown to ball out. Like, I don't want to give up. I want Jurian Dickey to ball out. Like, I want these guys to hit. I want to see Noah Rogers at NC State get some run. I really I want those guys to do well. So
yeah. All right, let's go to some player profiles of the day here at the Devy Digest. What we do is we essentially give you crib notes of who these players are, what they do well, what they need improvement on. When I first got into C2C and Devy, there really wasn't much info around unless it was on like a Caleb Williams or Marvin Harrison. So each episode where we're going to try to break down these guys, I'm going to break down a 2024 draft eligible guy to get you ready for your rookie drafts. Then I'll get you a CFF profile of the day, get you ready for possibly your sub drafts, and then under the radar freshman. So the first guy we have is LSU wide receiver Malik Nabers, 6 feet, 201 pounds. He's a very good route runner, has a knack for creating separation. He does everything well. He also bailed out Jaden Daniels a lot, has strong hands, and he tracks the ball pretty well. There are some weaknesses to his game. The very first thing is he doesn't excel in any one aspect. He does everything well, but there's not something that you can say, okay, this is what he's going to excel at the next level. And then also, is he going to end up being a Robin instead of a Batman at the next level? Now, the next guy we have is a CFF profile of the day. That's going to be Hawaii's Pofele Ashlock. He was someone that I really liked last season. He is 6'2", 175 pounds, a very good route runner, a little on the thin side, but he understands spacing in the modern day run and shoot for Timmy Chang. Now, he knows where the soft spot in the zone coverage is, and he will sit down in that area. The entire offense for Hawaii does come back. Braden Schrager withdrew from the portal, so he will be back at Hawaii. His running mate, Stephen McBride, has 1 year left. So the entire nucleus is there. I would not be surprised if Hawaii makes a bull run and gets 6 wins this year. It's a sneaky play. We know Hawaii gets the volume on offense. He has top 10 CFF upside. And when I did look on Fantrax at the time, he was 10% rostered. So he's probably someone that's going to be available in the supplemental drafts this coming summer. Now let's go ahead and take a look at an under the radar freshman here. We have Isiah Canion for Georgia Tech. He is 6'3", 193 pounds. He's a 4-star in the composites. Now, he was as high as wide receiver 12 and as low as wide receiver 71. He averages out to be a wide receiver 39. He's a tier 4 wide receiver for me in the 24 class. What I like about him is that Georgia Tech is not afraid to play their young guys. They played true freshman Eric Singleton last year. He played and broke out. Malik Rutherford was also someone that I believe was a redshirt freshman last year. He got some playing time, and I believe he was the second leading receiver on that team. Both of those guys are about 5'11" and under. I think Malik Rutherford was like 5'8". So with Canion, with him being 6'3", he brings a different dimension. Now with him, he was originally committed to Notre Dame, but he is a Georgia kid, and Georgia Tech was able to flip him late in the process. He is a very athletic player. He played quarterback, wide receiver, and he also took some handoffs in the running back position. And at times, he was also a hybrid defensive guy. He played linebacker and I believe it was safety. He also played baseball in high school. He's a very instinctive player. He has really good burst, really good acceleration, has a big catch radius. He high points the ball. Got very strong hands. There's good body control there. And with him, there's just something there that I like about him. Now, those are the profiles of the day, and we'll give that to you with every episode. But Noah, what can people expect? What are you in the works? What are you doing? What's going on with you right now?
Yeah, man, I appreciate that. Also, just to state, love guys who play all over the field like that. It's a great way to honestly, and you can track this back, but if you look at Keenan Allen, I don't know if people know this. Keenan Allen was a 5-star safety coming out of high school that converted to wide receiver. There's a few other players of that archetype. It's really fun to look back. So I love that call. I don't know Isiah Canion, so I'm excited to look into him. First of all, this was a blast. I really appreciate you having me on and working with my night work schedule. You're one of my favorite people to talk to in the space, and will continue to be, especially now that we finally got to meet in person, or on video, whatever this is. What am I doing? So I am hosting Devy Digest, which is a podcast that normally during the season is weekly. In the off season, we're still figuring some things out. And that format for that podcast is changing a little bit. Just because Todd Vincent took a step back, and I'll miss Todd. but I'm excited. I've got this coming Monday. I've got an episode with Katie Flower, who is the original Devy Diva. She has been doing Devy since like 2016, 2017. Had taken a little bit of a step back from content, but it's coming on this week. So I'm super excited. We'll pub that episode. And we're going to be doing having a lot of guests on Devy Degens in the coming weeks to really continue to dive into these topics, continue to try to help discuss strategy for C2C startups, strategy for C2C supplementals, look into the NFL draft as it comes up and do some discussions about that, talking about the upcoming freshman class and their landing spots, their impact, and diving into those topics. So please definitely tune into Devy Degens. And I'm also going to be doing some college and some dynasty content with Fantasy and Frames, which is another great group and organization with incredibly talented folks. So please give them a follow as well. And you can expect to see some content coming in the next couple months. This is a little bit of a quieter period for sure. But right now I'm grinding on just continuing to get as much of this freshman class observed as I possibly can, which has, as my first year in it, I'm a little bit behind where I would like to be going into next year, but getting a sense of how I'm ranking some of these guys and getting to look at their tape a little bit. And I highly recommend people do that if you're into this kind of stuff. Just look at, like, Huddle has tape on these guys. You can go find little clips, and even if people are like, oh, don't watch YouTube, go do that. Watch it. Like, we aren't NFL scouts. Go watch 3 to 5 minutes of a guy and just see if you like his game. And so I'll doing that. Gonna have some NFL draft rankings coming out as well with Degens, and again, really excited to be on. And you can definitely find me on Twitter. I'm very active on there. Feel free to DM me, and I definitely post takes and ideas there a bunch. We'll see where it goes. And I'm excited to have been on and get to meet you, man. I appreciate the invite.
Yeah, I appreciate you hopping on, Noah. For everyone, please go follow Noah. You can find him on X at Noah_FF_green. And then we'll be back next week. But before we go, if you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button, comment, subscribe. You can follow me at Andy_fam1. And if you're listening on Spotify and Apple, give us a rate and review. And then we'll see you next time on the Devy Digest.